Mr. Wolf, thank you for having us here in the offices of the Financial Times, the newspaper you started working for in 1987, am I right?
That is correct.
It's a long time.
Yeah, but I was already 41. And so I feel that I came almost in mid-career.
Okay, so we're having this conversation in English, but with your mother being from the Netherlands, Dutch might have been an option, or?
No, I think my Dutch isn't good enough to carry out an interview. I had, I don't have any more, the Dutch of a 12-year-old.
Okay.
Up to the age of 12, I used to spend a lot of time in the Netherlands. But by that time, my grandparents had died, and we stopped going to the Netherlands so frequently. So that's the level of Dutch I have. So to have a discussion of this kind in Dutch would be pretty well impossible.
Okay. So your mother was Dutch, your father was Austrian. You were born here in London a year after the war, World War II. So your origin story with your family having escaped the Nazi regime has influenced your view on life a lot. I read.
I think that's true of many children of refugees, from whatever the cause of their movement. I've got to learn this. People whose parents or who themselves have been forced to flee for their lives from a regime which is threatening to kill them, become pretty insecure. And I think it's very clear it affects their children. And the crucial thing I've learned from this, particularly since this emanated in this case from Germany, which was after all considered in the late 19th century one of the most progressive, sophisticated, civilized, educated, highly educated societies in the world history, that this could collapse in the way it did in the interwar period was obviously at the time an unimaginable shock, but it's also a lesson. And the lesson to me is one should never take political and social stability for granted.
Indeed, because when you look at what's happening right now, with the war that Russia started last year, we see war in Europe is not something merely from the history books. Do you think, when we look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that we're heading to a very long war, just as World War I and II, for years and years, or do you see a conclusion or a solution?
Well, there are two aspects to that. I just want to make an earlier point. I don't want to make a comparison in any simple way between Putin and Hitler. That is not what I'm trying. But there is something in common. In the Russian case, this is a great empire, huge empire which was inherited from history, just as Germany had been a very great power before the First World War, and again, of course, it's clearly one of the reasons why Hitler, when he became leader, was determined, as it were, to avenge the outcome of the First World War and re-establish German power in Europe. Now, I think something very similar is happening with the Russians. They don't accept, about Putin and his people around him, but also I think a lot of the Russian people, they lost their empire. The economic transformation after the loss of their empire failed, partly because they refused to adapt to the reality that they'd lost the Cold War, and Putin exploits this and makes it worse, exacerbates it. And I think this is a revanchist project that he's engaged in.
Which makes it more difficult for him to stop the war.
Yes, exactly. He's decided, I don't know whether this was true from the beginning with him, but he's decided that his project is to reestablish the Russian Empire. And that's rather essentially, but even worse, what Hitler tried to do. I mean, he wanted to not only reestablish the German Empire, but add to it Lebensraum. So the point is, we're dealing with an irredentist political movement. So in that being the case, and from all that I know about the propaganda that they're using in Russia, it is very difficult to see how they give up. and that means that it could well be a very long war if they don't win, which I certainly don't want them to, and it could be a very, very difficult war to end because it's not clear what the terms will be. So we are, I think, let's be realistic about this. I don't think we can let Ukraine lose, but we are in an immensely difficult situation. And I wrote this in one column. In a way, you could say Putin is the most dangerous person in world history because unlike Hitler, he has 5,000 nuclear warheads, along with his irredentism. So this is a very, very dangerous moment. I mentioned this very much in passing in our earlier discussion. But the key point is, yes, this is it's difficult to know how this will end, and it could end very badly.
Yeah. When we look back at recent history, Russia was involved with the United States in a Cold War, which is a totally different kind of war. And now there seems to emerge a new kind of Cold War between the United States and China. Now, you yourself have written about, and it's a bit difficult, so I will read it, that we should try to achieve a relationship of cooperation, competition, coexistence, and calibrated confrontation. Lots of C's. Can you elaborate a little bit further on that concept of the calibrated confrontation? Looks like an intelligent way of fighting
without fighting. In some ways, we are in a situation not so different from that of the Cold War. And the crucial thing about the Cold War is that it remained cold. Though it was very close at some points, particularly over the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that frightened people, a lot. And so they decided to find ways of managing the cooperation, defining the spheres of influence of the parties and talking to one another, détente, all this. It's going to be more difficult with China because it's a much bigger power and more comprehensive power than the Soviet Union. And in addition, we're deeply interconnected with China. We have close, strong economic relations with China. We trade a lot with it. And
we can't ignore them.
And we can't ignore them on that side. And furthermore, we have some things we have to do together. So to give you two examples, one is climate and managing the climate. But another is all the development challenges. So to take a very contemporary example, there are huge debt problems in developing countries now. Many of them owe a lot of money to China, really a lot of money. In some cases, it's their principal creditor. But they also owe money to the West. Now, we don't want to forgive our debts just so that they can pay China, and China doesn't want to forgive its debt so that they can pay us. So we have to cooperate. It's another area of cooperation. And we have to cooperate if you want to sustain any form of globalization, because they're an important trading partner to countries important to us, and vice versa. We don't want all of Asia to go and trade only with China, but otherwise we are in competition. Yep. So these are all ways in which we have to cooperate and deal with them because of the shared world economy. At the same time, we have very different values and we have different interests. So a salient example, of course, is Taiwan, the issue of Taiwan. Another is the Chinese relationship with Russia, which threatens us. So this is calibrated competition, short of war. It will be very, very difficult to do, but there are areas where we're clearly going to have to defend ourselves, keep strategic autonomy economically and industrially. That's clearly essential. Make sure that China doesn't come to dominate countries that are important to us, while continuing to cooperate.
Yeah. When talking about cooperation, what's the role for national institutions?
I think that's what can supranational institutions do? I like the supranational institutions, and some of them are absolutely indispensable. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in similar institutions, development. But we have to recognize that the idea of rules-based supranational organizations, institutions that whose rules are automatically followed by great powers, which was the hope with the World Trade Organization. That looks as though it's just not going to work anymore, because some of the great powers, in this case particularly the US, are just not going to obey them, and we can't force them to. There isn't the power to do so. So it looks as though we are moving increasingly from that ideal, which I very much share, of supranational order based with institutions and rules, into one of classic great power relations, which are about negotiation, spheres of influence, recognizing spheres of influence, and constant adjustment. This is a very complex and risky process, and it's frequently broken down, but that looks to me the sort of order we're moving into.
Yeah. You talk about something that is broken. When we take a look at the protectionist politics of the Biden administration, for example, and its Inflation Reduction Act, that has a huge influence on Europe. Mm-hmm. How do you think that Fortress Europe should enter into a kind of subsidy race within the countries itself? And how do you prevent like, a small economy as Flanders from being squeezed in between those bigger nations with bigger pockets, maybe?
I think this is unbelievably difficult. Mm-hmm. So first of all, it's clear that the US has moved into a strongly nationalist phase of politics. And this is bipartisan, mm-hmm. and in addition, it's protectionist.
Yeah, it's putting America first.
It's America first. So in this sense, Trump defined a new era. And while that's principally focused on China, it also has pretty big implications for Europe. And for Europe, the problems are the US remains its principal security ally. Mm-hmm. Europe is not strategically independent. It has not been since the war, and it doesn't look at all likely that it will be soon. There isn't the cohesive will to do what will be needed to make Europe genuinely strategically independent. So it has that relationship. If the Europeans are going to deal with China effectively, we're going to deal with China effectively. There has to be, and Russia, there has to be an alliance. So the alliance is important. But the United States is not going to play by the rules that the Europeans would like them to play by. And Europe doesn't have the power to force them to. That's pretty obvious. So what do the Europeans do? I think there are two elements from my perception, and I don't think it's what's going to happen. The first is that the Europeans have to act together. And there is a real danger that this subsidy war you mentioned will in fact become a national subsidy war, or in which case, pretty obvious, Germany's going to win. Mm-hmm. I mean, because
they have the deepest pockets.
But they have the deepest pockets. And for a small economy, as you mentioned, Flanders, well, that's not going to work. I mean, you'll always be outbid by almost anybody. So this is one of the big arguments for Europe acting together, is that everybody in Europe will have a fair shake. Those were the arguments for the rules. But if we have a subsidy war, I think it should be a European one. Of course, I'm talking for Britain, which isn't part of it, alas. But that doesn't look as though how it's going to go. So there's a real tension within Europe on that. And then there's the tension of Europe as a whole vis-a-vis America. The Europeans are, I think, not going to generate together the sort of resources America has, because they don't have they're fiscally really very small. They don't have an integrated public finances because they're not an integrated state. So they're going to have to find a way of cooperating with the US too in all these areas. Because if it comes to subsidy races, I think America is going to beat Europe. Yeah. So coming back to sort of the fundamental point, in this new world, a superpower conflict, which is cross-the-board conflict, sort of military and security, spheres of influence, economic, Europe is not so well positioned against China on the one hand and US on the other. And I don't know how Europe will resolve that.
When you're talking to, in that context, we're talking about globalization as well. You have written the book Why Globalization Works, but at the same time, we do feel that the support for globalization has reduced a lot, certainly with the middle class. You yourself hold the deindustrialization partly responsible for this?
Yeah, well, first of all, my book, Why Globalization Works, was strangely nowadays mainly focuses on the question, does globalization benefit developing countries? Because that was the big argument 22 years ago when I started working on it. There were lots of people in the West saying we should stop globalization because it impoverishes developing countries. Well, now this has turned around. The reason we're so frightened of globalization is because it impoverishes us, because the developing and emerging countries, China, India, so forth, are doing so well. So this is a very different focus. Now, my own sense of this, and I've looked at the literature very clearly, the analysis very carefully, that with a few exceptions, the impact of trade on industrial economies and industrial employment, if you look at the developed countries as a whole, has actually been relatively small compared with the impact of technology, which has been enormous. So over the last 30, 40 years, technology and demand, over the last 30 or 40 years, the demand for manufactures in richer countries like ours has been relatively weak. It hasn't grown very strongly. It's grown, but it hasn't grown that strongly. And we have had continuing massive increases in productivity. So every economy in the industrial world, whether it had a huge trade surplus in manufactures like Germany, or whether it had a large deficit in manufactures like the US or UK, they've all experienced very rapid declines in the labor force in manufacturing and industry as a relative to the rest of the economy.
We had,
so this is...
Renault Vilvoorde, we had Opel Antwerp, Ford Inc. They all disappeared.
Yes, but
can we bring them
back?
The
big reason for that, I would suggest, is if you look, it's not because Europe is not a huge net importer of cars. It continues to be a very large producer, but we've known for decades that Europe had huge excess capacity in cars. Our plants have become vastly more productive. The workforce needed in them is much smaller. The companies are all trying to consolidate, and these are about massive internal shifts. My own view is it's very plausible in the end. We might produce as many cars as we did 30, 40 years ago. There'll be different cars, of course, because many of them will be electric. The labor force will be far smaller than it used to be. Most of them will be produced by robots, and there will be far fewer plants because it's efficient. Then this is economic change. And I think that the old industrial labor forces, and this is part of the problems we face, will never return. There's nothing we can do about it. Essentially, my view is that what's happening to manufacturing industry is what once upon a time happened to agriculture. Remember that 200 years ago, 70% of our populations worked in farming. Now it's less than 1. Why? Because we produce more. The problem is that we produce it so much more efficiently. And so we end up in the sectors where we can produce more efficiently that no one gets employed in them. And I think manufacturing, I don't think it's obvious, is going through the same process. We're not going to reverse that. We can keep production, but it will be production predominantly by robots in very, very large factories, and many of the existing plants will disappear. And that's an adjustment we can expect, and we have to manage, and so far we've managed the adjustment very badly.
Okay, so let's move from the economy to the politics. We have seen here in the UK the Brexit. We have seen the rise of Donald Trump, but still, after all the things we've learned about that, there is still a huge appetite in Europe for populist politicians, even with hindsight of what happened before. Take a look at France, for example, or Sweden. How do you think more centrist parties can withstand the heat and get back the support of the majority of people? What are the tips and tricks they should...
Well, one, I think it's going to be very difficult because it's quite late. And as you rightly point out, it's very clear that the old established parties of the continent, center-left, center-right, are by and large having great difficulty. Political parties seem to have almost disappeared in France. Yeah. I mean, it's become personal politics to a substantial extent. Look who's just become Prime Minister of Italy. I mean, at the moment, she seems quite sensible. We have to remember, she is a neo-fascist. You mentioned Sweden in the most surprising place. So it's obvious that very large parts of our public, of our people, a lot of it the old working class, industrial working class, some other elements, are completely disenchanted with conventional politics, which no longer has the hold upon them it used to have. And there are many obvious reasons, which I've mentioned already, which are clear why this has happened. Now, I do, in a book I've recently written about all this, on this crisis, I put up forward lots of ideas of what you might want to do, but my summary of it is twofold. We need conventional politicians to find ways to convince people that they have policies and ideas which will benefit their lives. And that does mean almost certainly a more active government than before, and certainly a government which is clearly driving towards faster growth, more job creation, better jobs, and that's going to be very difficult in the current circumstances. And that means probably quite intelligent, targeted spending in innovation, in supporting new activities, particularly in regions hit by industrial change. Nobody has done this perfectly, but that's the sort of thing you have to look for. I think in some countries, probably not so much in most continental countries, there's the questions of income redistribution. There are questions about how you manage really difficult areas like immigration. But I think the truth is, and I go through many of these, that there isn't a simple way of dealing with these pressures. One hope I have had is indeed that as we look at what populist politicians do, people will realize they're a fraud, that they don't offer actually any real improvement, and that but people by and large don't learn from other people's mistakes. So they think they're somebody else's. But I do hope a little bit, it's not a view I would have had 10 years ago, that the sort of thing Joe Biden is trying to do, at least in saying government can do things, government can help. You should trust rational policy making rather than completely irresponsible populist policy making, that will begin to have an influence, just as in the 30s, FDR had influence. I think he was the most important politician of the 20th century. But I do think now that the old Europe, in which the EU's role was to hold the ring and let the private sector solve everything and hope that that will be enough, that no longer looks credible. And so we're going to need more active politics and more active political processes dealing with these challenges, responding to them. And I think that's going to require more EU action. And in that sense, I thought Next Gen EU was a rather bold innovation. And I think some more things like that will probably be required. But I really don't know whether we're going to be able to fix these problems.
We've talking about shifts and shocks and challenges. Is there something that brings hope to you when you see technological innovations? Or is there something that appeals to you most, that you set your hopes on for the future?
I don't think there's one thing that I hope for. I don't think there is a single thing. I do think, well, just let me talk about two different things. I think that what's happened on renewable energy in the last 20 years is quite encouraging. We're very, very far from having solved it. Very far, I think. But we're beginning to imagine that we might find a way of moving from a fossil fuels-based economy to one based on renewables, possibly including nuclear power, possibly technologies which are not yet feasible, like fusion, who knows. But we may actually have the resources, technological resources, to solve a very, very big problem without having, as it were, to close down our economy, which is never going to be accepted. So there's technological hope. It is quite possible that some of the new technologies, AI and so forth, will solve some of the problems we have in affording our medical systems, affording the huge costs associated with aging. Maybe they're going to be able to help us somewhat. I'm moderately optimistic that in a world of nuclear power, we can contain the risks associated with war, nuclear powers, nuclear weapons. Remember, we haven't had a head-on war between the great powers since the Second World War. With luck, we will manage to sustain that, even given the Russian disaster. And finally, my biggest hope is I do believe in democracy and market economies. We've come through terrible challenges in the past, but I have a sort of basic belief that hope, can be no more than a hope, that free societies will find ways, now that it's clear how big the challenges are, that we cannot be complacent. It just isn't going to run on. That elites and ordinary people will together say, we've got to make our societies work. Let's discuss what that means in our political reform and in economic and social reform, because that's clearly what we have to do.
Okay. I'd like to thank you a lot for this interview, for your speech you've given. But one last question.
I thought we got to the end.
Last question. You studied classics at university. Is there one? Have you got one favorite expression in Latin?
There are two, but the one I'm going to use is actually in Greek. So, because it's a motto in my book. My book has a motto which comes from the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, and it's Meda Nagan, which means essentially never too much. That is to say, a sophisticated, civilized society is about balancing and managing contradictions. That's always the case. Our societies are too complex to believe there are simple solutions. The most dangerous thing we can believe, and that was, I think, the great danger that we saw in previous periods of disaster, that there is one solution. If you give all power to somebody, revolutionary hero of the right or left, we will solve all our problems. The real problem is that we've unbalanced our economies and societies, and we have to rebalance them again. So it's a sort of modified but quite aggressive conservative view.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Mr. Wolf.
Pleasure.